All right, I think everyone's in from the waiting room. Welcome again, everyone. My name is Greta Zaro, and I'm the organizing director with World Beyond War. And I am so excited to welcome you to today's Irish chapter webinar. First, some logistics. So for today's webinar, we will be using the chat box to collect questions and comments. So you can feel free to put your thoughts in the chat box, and we will try to make some space for Q&A at the end and pull those questions out of the chat. Another piece of logistics, we have enabled the closed captioning for today's webinar. So if you'd like to use that feature to view English captions, you can click on the CC button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom control panel, and you can enable captions. If you don't want them, you can also disable them from that button as well. And a reminder that they are automatic captions done by robots, so sometimes there are errors. Please excuse us for those. So now, before we jump into today's discussion, we are going to show a short 2-minute video to introduce World Beyond War's work to you. World Beyond War is a grassroots global network to end all war. Our mission is to abolish the institution of war. Founded in 2014, World Beyond War is a decentralized network run by volunteers around the world, taking action in their communities, with a small staff providing support and resources. Signing the Declaration of Peace is a commitment to work non-violently towards our mission to end all war. Tens of thousands of people across 192 countries have signed World Beyond War's Peace Pledge. Our work is centered on two main pillars: peace education and nonviolent direct action. We debunk the myths of war, demonstrating that war is not inevitable, necessary, beneficial, or just. Our books, online courses, webinars, fact sheets, and other educational materials underscore the reasons to end war, what we call the 7 whys. The AGSS, the Alternative Global Security System, is World Beyond War's blueprint for how we can demilitarize security, manage conflict non-violently, and create a culture of peace. Our second pillar is our action campaigns, with particular focus on weapons divestment and closing military bases. Intersectionality, connecting the dots between issues, is crucial to our approach, which recognizes that war is a leading contributor to racism, climate change, economic inequality, and so much more. Nonviolence is also key to our organizing approach, based on research proving the efficacy of nonviolence versus violence. From taking action to block the arms trade, to campaigning in solidarity with communities in active war zones, our work takes many forms around the globe. Through our distributed model, our chapters and affiliates take the lead by working on strategic issues of importance to their communities towards the goal of war abolition. Join the movement at WorldBeyondWar.org. Wonderful, and we hope that you'll go to WorldBeyondWar.org and sign our Declaration of Peace if you haven't signed it yet. So let's turn to today's topic. In today's conversation, Peadar King, producer and presenter of the RTE Global Affairs series, What in the World, and author of numerous books, including War, Suffering, and the Struggle for Human Rights, will discuss with former Army officer and peace activist Ed Horgan the role of over 38 peace activists who have been prosecuted by the Irish state for protesting at Shannon Airport against Irish complicity in US Middle East wars. Peadar, over to you.
Thanks very much, Greta. Good evening and welcome everybody to this seminar. I'm delighted to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes, possibly 40 minutes in the company of Edward Horgan. So Edward, you're very welcome to join in this conversation. I thought I'd start with an easy question for you, Ed, and it seems to me that in a way you're a bit of a conundrum, are you not? A former army officer, now a peace activist. So are you that conundrum?
I agree. Many people see me as a conundrum, and coming from a military background, now being a peace activist, I would say I'm not really. My military service was mainly in a genuine defence force, and it involved several missions with the United Nations. So my first peace actions were actually during my military service as the United Nations military peacekeeper. It's also where I saw war at the coalface, and where I would have been exposed to bombs, was almost killed on several occasions. But I also got to appreciate the value of Irish neutrality. It's what makes the Irish Defence Forces probably one of the best United Nations peacekeepers in the world, because we come from what was a genuinely neutral country. And that's one of the reasons why later in life, when I saw Irish neutrality being eroded significantly, that I decided to continue with my peace activism in a different role.
Okay, and let's talk through that peace activism. You've been associated, and very strongly associated, with Shannon Watch for a long number of years. Can you talk us through Shannon Watch, its origins, and what your objectives are in Shannon Watch?
Yeah, well, I suppose Shannon Watch itself was only founded, I think, in the 2008 or thereabouts. What was happening in Shannon started to a significant degree in 2001, just after 9/11, and I became actively involved at that point with quite a number of other peace activists. Shortly after 9/11, our Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern at the time, literally invited the US to use Shannon Airport for its war and overthrow of the government of Afghanistan. I discovered very early on that US military planes were going to, and I helped to organise the first demonstration at Shannon Airport on the 11th of November 2001 with a group of students from the University of Limerick. So that was the first demonstration at Shannon Airport. And we fairly quickly discovered that not only were troops going through, but they were carrying weapons with them, and that this was in clear breach of Irish neutrality. At that stage, relatively few people were being killed. So I suppose one of our main concerns would be breaches of international law, including neutrality. As things developed and the situation in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular deteriorated rapidly, I think most of us realised that there were gross breaches of international law occurring. The UN Charter was being almost thrown out the window, in fact. The countries, especially Britain, France and United States, who are supposed to be upholding the UN Charter as permanent members of the UN Security Council, were in fact acting in gross breach of it. And that's where I suppose it started for me. Shannon Watch has been actively,
sorry, Edward, to cut across. Just to give us a sense of the strategic importance of Shannon Airport and where it's located, and why do you think the Americans have used what is a relatively small airport on the west of Ireland? So if you kind of paint that picture for us.
There is a feeling at large that Shannon Airport is very important for the US military. It's a completely false suggestion. The US military has dozens, if not hundreds, of airports and bases in NATO countries that are equally suitable for their use as Shannon Airport is. My own belief is that the US military and the US government in particular wants to make neutral countries, Ireland in particular, involved in their wars of aggression. They want to make us complicit, and therefore we can be more easily silenced. Right now, in fact, Ireland is a member of the UN Security Council, and I would argue that we are being far too silent in criticising what NATO and the US are doing and what other countries are doing, because we are complicit. But Shannon Airport is of relatively little value to the US military, other than making a neutral country complicit.
Okay, so it's not an official US military base, but would you regard it as a quasi-official?
Yes, in fact, the description used by a number of people is it's been used as a forward airbase for the US, and it has been used very significantly, well in excess of 3 million troops, possibly now as many as 4 million. We use the figure of 3 million because the only figures we have are for troops going through on chartered planes. They don't include troops going through on military planes. So the number of troops going through over the last 20 years in particular is well in excess of 3 million troops, each of them carrying an assault rifle with them, and a huge amount of other military equipment also going through, in gross breach of international laws on neutrality.
That's an astounding figure, isn't it?
It is a shocking figure and completely unnecessary from an Irish point of view. Our reputation as a neutral country, which is one of the reasons we were elected onto the Security Council for a 4th time. And we're now halfway through that 2-year term. And we are, I think, abusing that to a very significant degree.
And as part of your protest, as part of Shannon Watch's protest, you felt entitled to illegally enter the airport. Would you agree with that construction of what you did, that you illegally and in violation of Irish law entered the airspace of Shannon Airport?
No, I would not agree. Yes, by all means, I entered Shannon Airport on several occasions as it happened. At one stage, literally climbed over the fence. On another occasion, when I was on my way to London on a flight, I discovered there were 4 US Hercules C-130 aircraft at the airport, and I felt compelled to go and try and search them, knowing I would be arrested. But I strongly argue, and the cases I've been prosecuted for so far have actually been, I've been found not guilty, or the cases have been dismissed. I strongly believe that what I was doing was justified. It was not illegal, and I had lawful excuse for doing what I did. And this is a point that I will discuss later on in several of the cases. It's a little bit like a fireman coming on a fire situation. And in one of my previous careers, I actually had been a fireman. If a fireman arrives at your house, he doesn't necessarily knock at the door. He's entitled to break down your door, go in and rescue people, because he is justified in doing so. Likewise, the actions of the peace activists at Shannon Airport, I would say all 38 of them who did actions that the state considered were illegal, did so with lawful excuse and with full justification.
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy you use of the fire and a house on fire. Do you think the world is on fire? And I'm not talking in terms of climate change, which has been much discussed in relation to a conference in Glasgow, but from a peace activist point of view, would you?
Well, actually, I think it's important. It's on fire from both points of view, in fact, and they are both intrinsically interconnected. The abuse of the military around the world has the peace situation on the world on fire, but it is also very significantly causing significant damage to the environment. And the fires you're seeing in Russia, in Brazil, California, and elsewhere are partly caused by the military. They're one of the worst polluters in the world, and they are clearly interconnected.
Take us back to on one of the occasions in which you were accosted or arrested. I'm not too sure what the precise legal term is. What happens in this situation where a civilian takes direct action by entering, whether it's legally or illegally, we can argue, courts do is argue on that issue. But what was your personal experience on one of those occasions? Can you just give us a picture of that, Edward?
I suppose I've been arrested and prosecuted so far 5 times. The first time is always the most difficult, because you're nervous, and the idea of knowing you're going to be arrested and charged. Normally we go in knowing that if we do cross the fence, cross a red line, and do possibly some damage to an aircraft, we know we are going to be arrested. It would be our policy to remain at the scene, not to do damage and then run away. primarily because we don't want anybody else to be injured. All our actions are very clearly peaceful, non-violent actions. But yes,
be considered very respectful actions. I'm taking it that the actual interactions that you have with either the police or personnel within the airspace, that is done in a very mutually respectful way.
yes, it is, in fact, and our code of practice always, it includes even small little things like you walk, you don't necessarily run, you don't threaten people in any way, and if you are arrested, you allow yourself to be arrested peacefully, and if you have done some damage, you point out the damage that you might have done, particularly if it was something that might make the plane dangerous from a taking off point of view. And this has been the case in virtually all the peace actions that were carried out at Shannon Airport.
So in a sense, the personnel who are arresting you may not very well agree with you, but they, I guess, respect the reasons you're doing it and possibly even understand the rationale behind your intervention.
Yes, and in fact, in a number of occasions, recently, particularly in the last year or two, some of the Gardaí have quietly approached me and say, Ed, we actually agree with what you're doing, but we have to do our job and arrest you. And clearly I go in and the other peace activists go in almost with the intention of being arrested, because it's our way of putting the Irish government on trial, an indirect way of putting the Irish government on trial and highlighting the abuses that are happening with the Irish government and the other authorities, including the Airport Authority and the Gardaí. So it's our indirect way of putting Ireland and the Irish government on trial.
Yeah, and I want to talk to you later on about winning the hearts and minds, because that's the whole rationale and objective of peace activism. But in a sense, you're winning the hearts and minds of the very people that you encounter in these situations, and critically important people involved in police work, within the army, within the agents of the state. So that's a very, very important point of engagement. But can I move on? And I know we're constrained in terms of what we can talk about in relation to the forthcoming court cases. But are you at liberty to talk to us about what the charges against you are? And can you just maybe talk us through what those charges are?
Yes, in fact, they're fairly typical charges for many peace activists, not just me, but Colm Ruddy, Dave Donlan had a very similar charge brought against them. Thankfully, they were actually acquitted last year on the basis of lawful excuse in the Circuit Court in Dublin. Claire Daly and Mick Wallace also went in for a similar event. So the idea is that in my case, the charges are trespass and criminal damage. I am alleged to have written graffiti on the engine of a US Navy plane, the words "danger, danger, do not fly." Clearly, I will be pleading not guilty, and I will be defending myself in court. Other than that, I won't even speculate as to what the result might be.
Sure, and indeed, we're not asking you to do that. When is that court case?
It's due to take place in the Circuit Court in Dublin on the 13th of December. We managed, first of all, to get the trials up from the Circuit Court level to jury level, or from the District Court to the Circuit Court, and then transfer to Dublin, where we can be assured, a fair trial by jury.
Okay, and I want to move away now from your for those very clear reasons. But as you've just indicated, you're not the first person by any stretch of the imagination to engage in this form of civil disobedience. And I know there are quite a number, and we will come to those in some detail later on. But briefly, can you talk us through some of the sort of landmark cases that have been through the Irish courts to date?
Sure, yeah. The first case was actually Owen Dufsky way back in 2002. Went into the airport, again, wrote some graffiti did a spray painting job on a US Hercules C-130. He was actually convicted. He appealed it, and he lost his appeal. And I think he was eventually fined €1,000. The next case involved a significant group of people. 50 people managed to get into the airport. It happened almost accidentally. Somebody started shaking the fence. The fence was so badly rusted, it literally collapsed. And I think a group of about 50 people went onto the airport itself. 9 of them were actually prosecuted and got various fines at the district court level. One of them, Dr. Fenton Lane, decided not to pay his fine and spent some time in prison because of that. And again, that was the first example of somebody deliberately not paying their fine in order to highlight and get more publicity. And subsequently, others adopted a similar strategy, including Margaret Darcy and our 2 TDs at the time, Claire Daly and Mick Wallace. So there are different strategies. The next, I suppose, big issue or case at Shannon Airport was Mary Kelly, who went in, I think, on the 29th of January 2003. Again, she targeted a US Navy plane and with an axe did allegedly $1.5 million worth of damage. Her first case failed to reach a verdict, and so she had to endure 2 trials. She was eventually found guilty, and she then appealed her guilty verdict to the Court of Criminal Appeal. In fact, it was appealed first to the High Court. The High Court upheld the Circuit Court's decision. That was appealed to the Appeal Court, and in a landmark decision, in fact, the Appeal Court found in favour of Mary Kelly. And again, it was on the issue of lawful excuse. And it's a complicated piece of Irish legislation. It means primarily that if a person genuinely believes that they're doing what would otherwise be considered criminal damage for justified reasons, but they have to persuade the jury that what they're doing is justified, or that they had a genuine belief themselves that it was justified. And on that basis, Mary Kelly won her case. The next big trial, in fact, was, yes, and it's also of interest that the Court of Criminal Appeal didn't rule on Mary Kelly's case for 11 years after the original incident, which clearly was a case of justice being delayed unduly. The 5 Catholic workers, Deirdre Clancy, Newan Dunlop, Karen Fallon, Damien Moran, Kieran O'Reilly, again into Shannon Airport, literally 5 days after Mary Kelly, damaged the same plane and allegedly did $2.5 million worth of damage. Again, they had 3 trials. The first 2 trials collapsed for various interesting reasons we won't go into. But on the last trial, the jury in Dublin, 12 honest jurors in Dublin, found them not guilty, and again on the basis of lawful excuse. And those 2 cases in particular, but particularly Mary Kelly's one, which was decided in the appeal court, which effectively is the highest court on the land from an appeal point of view, that has also had an effect, and it was one of the reasons, in fact, that Colin Roddy and Dave Donovan got off last year on a very similar charge. So they would have been the 2 important cases that, I suppose, set the rules. After that, let's see who comes next. Somebody called Edward Horgan. Oh yes.
Okay. I'll just stop you there, sure, for a moment. I am, of course, reminded by all jurors are honest jurors. As a footnote to your observation about 12 honest jurors.
Yeah, sure.
But on a more serious note, I mean, these are solitary tales. If people undertake this level of civil disobedience, yes, you're legally in for a long haul, and should not be taken lightly, I take it.
Yes, it's not for the faint-hearted.
Quite a lot.
Yes, not for the faint-hearted, and not everyone can afford to do it. You know, young people with a job and with a young family might decide not to get involved in this sort of thing. When my family, you know, were young, I wouldn't have got involved in this sort of thing. I only became involved when my family were up and running. So again, it's not for everybody, and it can be quite exhausting and quite challenging from many points of view. And it does involve courage and bravery by the people who do it for all the right reasons. And I would say that all 38 of the people that we have listed, and we may even have missed one or two, and I'm sure we probably did it for all the right reasons. Their actions were fully justified, regardless of the fact that in several cases they were convicted, but I would argue wrongly, and they probably would have, if they had appealed it properly, got off. But many of them choose not to appeal, again, for valid reasons also.
Sure. And just to broaden it out a bit, in terms then of the level of support there is amongst the general Irish population for the level of activism that you've talked about, how would you characterize that level of support?
It wanes and increases at different times. Just before the war in Iraq in 2003, we had huge demonstrations in Dublin. I think we had 100,000 in Dublin. There was well over 1 million in London. I happened to be in London at the time, so I marched with 1 million people in London, which was quite an experience in itself. As soon as that happened on the 15th of March 2003, literally a few days before the war started. As soon as the war started, the governments in Britain, Ireland, the United States and elsewhere ignored all the people marching. That dispirited an awful lot of people. So after that, there was a sort of a lacuna in which people were so frustrated that they lost interest and got on with their lives. In the meantime, because of the disasters that have unfolded in the Middle East, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen and elsewhere, people are now becoming much more engaged. And I think the more recent catastrophe in Afghanistan has focused people's minds. So in recent times, I am getting a strong impression that people are more supportive now of the peace movement than they had been for quite a long time after 2003. And that's encouraging.
There is arguably, Edward, an economic dividend to the US military presence in Shannon, or there is that perception, at least, that there is an economic dividend. And that can be sometimes quite difficult to make an argument that is perceived as hurting people's pockets. Is that the case, that there is an economic dividend? Does it benefit the Irish economy? Does it benefit the local economy? And is this something that you find difficult to talk to people about?
There is that impression that we are gaining money. And of course, if that were true, it's blood money, totally unjustified. The reality is, in fact, that isn't the case. A small amount of profit is made by the airport, but the reputational damage being done to the airport is probably one of the reasons why Shannon Airport is now a backwater, and it has been superseded by Cork already, and of course totally superseded by Dublin. In addition, in fact, the Irish taxpayer is paying a lot of money to assist the US military. We have a crazy system whereby the Irish government picks up the cost of air traffic control for all US military flights. And over a 20-year period, we have now calculated it has cost the Irish taxpayer in the region of 60 million euro to fund and to pay an organization called Eurocontrol for all the US military planes going to Shannon Airport. And there are other costs for security, the Gardaí, the military, or whatever. So that the amount it has cost the Irish taxpayer may well be close to 100 million euro. That money should be spent on education.
It's quite easy to debunk that economic dividend argument on the basis
Absolutely,
that there's
yeah.
actual cost rather than a benefit.
Yes, and also the false argument being made that the foreign direct investment would dry up if we didn't allow the US military to. Again, false argument completely. The companies who are investing in Ireland are doing it to avoid paying bigger tax in the United States. They don't care about the United States to a large extent, in fact. So it's false on several categories.
We mentioned earlier on when you were talking about your interactions with the Gardaí and the airport police that I was going to ask you to do a kind of 60-second pitch for winning the hearts and minds of Irish people. I think you've done that already, and I think really, really well. So I'm not actually going to ask you to go through that, but I am going to go back to more personal engagement with this, because in a way, Edward, you've set yourself an extraordinarily difficult and daunting task, which is effectively challenging US military hegemony, not just in Ireland, but in the world. And you're also doing it in the context, arguably, where the Irish government has turned a blind eye to all of that. So I'm curious to know what keeps you going.
Well, first of all, the Irish government would like to turn the blind eye to it, but what we are doing, and myself and the other 38, and many others as well, what we are doing is forcing the Irish government to effectively deal with the situation, and we are embarrassing them quite justifiably. In fact, one of my first actions, and I think it was the only one where someone actually put the government on trial, I actually took the government to the High Court in 2003 on constitutional and international law issues. And I was quite directly prosecuting the Irish government in that case. Now, while I lost the constitutional issues, the Irish government, the judge ruled that the Irish government was in clear breach of international laws and neutrality. But that's just one example. But what keeps me going, I think, largely because of my military service and what I saw of actual wars, but also in the meantime, I've worked a lot on election observation in post-conflict situations. I've seen the victims of war. I've met families who've lost children, children who've lost parents in wars, and that has convinced me that peace is the way that must be driven, and it does drive me. And I'll quote two cases in particular, that the type of case that makes me continue doing what I'm doing. The first one, people will remember, happened quite recently in Kabul on the 29th of August last, involving a US drone strike in which 7 children were killed. And I just mentioned some of their names, including Faisal, age 10, Farzad, aged 8, Armin, age 4, Benjamin, age 3, and 2 2-year-old cousins, girls named Malika and Samaya. May they rest in peace. That's just one, you might say, little incident. A much more serious incident happened, in fact, shortly before one of my incursions into Shannon Airport. It happened on the 15th of April, 2017. A convoy of buses carrying mainly women and children was targeted by terrorists who set off a massive car firebomb explosion, killing at least 109 people, including 80 children. Because I was involved in a project called Naming the Children, in which we are trying to name as many of the children killed as possible in the Middle East, I was unable to get the names of those children because the Western media didn't publish them, in fact, and when arguably they should have. So 6 months later, I decided to travel to Syria with a group of Irish peace activists. And my specific purpose in going was to get the names of those 80 people. And I did succeed in meeting a group of survivors of this dreadful bus bombing. Most of the people, the children in particular, were incinerated and blown to pieces. And the one of the people who told us their story was a young boy, 13-year-old, who had lost some of his friends, and also a grandmother who explained to us, she was in floods of tears, that she had lost 7 members of her own immediate family, her daughter-in-law and 4 children. And yet through her tears, she thanked us from the bottom of her heart for coming all the way from Ireland to listen to her story. And I will remember that lady for the rest of my life. but it's the trauma that these people are being suffering. Here in Ireland, friends and relatives die at different times from natural causes, and it's traumatic, on their immediate relatives. But at least it's natural, and they die in the company of their families and being well cared for by our health services. We must imagine for ourselves that absolutely dire trauma that all these people are going to. 1 million children since the first Gulf War have died unnaturally in bombs due to famine and other dreadful occurrences, totally illegally, totally unjustifiably. And that's what drives me, and I've little doubt it's what drives Colin Roddy and Owen Dufsky and all the other people in Mary Kelly, Catholic workers. So that's what keeps me going, and will keep me going for as long as I can. We may not succeed in stopping the wars. We're not arrogant enough to do that. But I believe we have had significant success. We have stopped Ireland so far going into NATO and totally abandoning Irish neutrality.
That actually was my last question, and I'm going to hand over to Caroline just immediately after this. And thank you very much indeed for your time and for, I suppose, the passion and the power of your words and your engagement and the history of it. It has been an inspiration for all of us, and I'm not here to embarrass you by saying that.
Sure.
I think it is important to acknowledge that and to say it, and I'm saying that in a way of tremendous respect for you personally and for your commitment and dedication. And I think I speak for everybody involved in the Irish chapter of World Without War and people involved in a whole plethora of peace organizations throughout the country. I just want to acknowledge and to thank you for that. But I just want to leave with one last question as well, which is, if you were to be successful, right? What would success look like, and how would you feel then, having achieved that success? So that's my final question, and thank you very much.
I suppose I'm a bit pragmatic. I won't necessarily stop the might of the US Army or clearly overturn Irish government policy. I will try and continue. I believe we have already succeeded in modifying government policy. I suppose if I could hope that we would stop the killing of children, even some children, but clearly killing any children, is totally unjustified. And we must, I suppose, and I would encourage all people involved with World Beyond War and elsewhere to even do more than we are doing. I honestly feel, even though you might think I've done a huge amount, that I haven't yet done enough, in fact, because I've seen the bodies in the desert, and I've met the people who have lost people like that. And maybe just finally to say as well that based on our research for this particular webinar, we will be producing a document with much more detailed information, in which we will discuss the various trials, list all the people, all the 38 and maybe more, and we will probably publish that document on the World Beyond War website, probably early in the new year. But to thank all those who have attended, and I suppose to encourage people to do a lot more. The idea of, I come from obviously a military background, the idea of ending war, creating a world beyond war, is totally justified. We do need police forces. We do need genuine defense forces, in my view. But wars of aggression, and in particular, what motivates me as well, the gross abuse of international law. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are meant to be the caretakers and the upholders of the UN Charter. And they are Britain, France, and Germany, or Britain, France, and the US in particular, are grossly abusing international law, and we are helping them. So thank you very much for listening so far.
Edward, thank you very much indeed. Caroline.
Thank you both very much. Can you hear me there?
Yes.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. And I'm always learning a lot from Ed and all your experience, which is quite unique, actually, Ed, I think, really. I was just wondering, was there any statement ever made by the US Army publicly about their role in Shannon? Do you know?
Yes, they would have made some statements criticising what the Catholic workers had done and others. On one occasion, in fact, it was revealed in WikiLeaks in a meeting between the US ambassador and I think our Foreign Affairs Minister, Dermot Ahern at the time, that the US military would have considered stop using Shannon Airport if the government insisted on it. And the response from the Irish government was, well, we wouldn't want to give in to those peace activists, would we? So yes, the US military were admitting they don't need Shannon Airport and would have been prepared. And again, it's one of the revelations from Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And clearly, like us, he is the one who is being prosecuted and unjustifiably targeted rather than the real criminals.
That's interesting, yes. I mean, it probably does kind of indicate perhaps that with changes in government from time to time, it's still worth trying to reach the people in power to change their minds. But what you said there relates back to another question as well, which was why all of a sudden a lot of Irish people seem to lose interest. And somebody mentioned that it might have been that the news stopped covering it. And maybe there was a reason why the news stopped covering the issues then. Would that be what you were saying?
Yes, and it's why we felt we had to continue to do peace actions in Shannon Airport to force the news to cover and to force the issue back into the public domain. And in that, I believe we have been relatively successful.
Okay. And somebody was wondering if you would like people to maybe come up to support you at the court case. There was a question about that.
Yes, now, obviously, the way things are going at the moment with the COVID-19, there may be limitations as to who can attend the court, but the court case is on the 13th of December. And yes, we would like support, and it'll be on in the Circuit Criminal Court in Dublin, which is in Parkgate Street. But yes, any support would be welcome. And also, just to mention that two of our other peace activists, our two Americans, Kenneth Myers and Tara Kauf, who also carried out a similar action, I think 3 years ago. They are due to go on trial also on the, I think the 22nd of April next. And again, we would ask for support. I see Kenneth Myers there. Kenneth, good to see you. And I'm sure Tarek is probably there somewhere as well.
Okay,
so yes,
okay. Yeah. We'll bear that in mind. And somebody else was asking if you could maybe give an example of some brief actions that people could take, people who are watching could take maybe to highlight the ongoing breach of our neutrality and complicity in the US wars.
Yes, I think we have monthly meetings at Shannon Airport on the second Sunday of every month, 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. It would be great for people to turn up at those, but also to take action in Dublin. And we do have protests in Dublin outside the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of Transport at various times. So maybe to watch the Shannon March website and support directly. We don't necessarily expect people to do arrestable offences because, as you mentioned, that doesn't suit everybody. But there are lots that we can do. Talk to your TDs. We need to force the government. We have a good democratic system in Ireland, and we're not using it properly in matters like this. It's as if 1 million children and 5 million people being killed in the Middle East are of no importance to us. Yet the people in the Middle East now are our neighbours. Our neighbours are all humankind, and we must treat them as our neighbours. Otherwise, we create refugee problems, people drowning in the Mediterranean and not being rescued. So we have a responsibility to do a lot more than we are doing. And it doesn't necessarily mean being dragged to the courts. There are many ways in which many people can support, and we do need many more people to get involved in the broader peace movement.
Okay, thank you. Somebody else wonders if the accumulation of just reason judgments, if they do or do not increase the pressure on the government to conduct the searches.
Yes, now I would argue this, well, we know in fact that the troops going through are all carrying automatic rifles with them. So effectively, more than 3 million automatic rifles had passed through Shannon Airport. Again, in gross breach of the, these are going through on civilian planes on contract to the US military. We've had a similar number of planes going, military planes going through, which our government are stating are not carrying weapons of any sort. This is totally incredible. Troops on those planes would not be allowed to leave the United States without their personal weapons. That's standard military practice. So now the government is saying they've had assurances from the US government. Clearly, from my point of view, somebody along the line is telling barefaced lies. I won't say who.
That's a challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Another regulatory problem there. If Greta is still with us, I wonder, Greta, would you be able to let Michael speak for just a second? He has his hand up there. Greta, is she there?
So Michael can now unmute.
Thank you.
That work? Is that working?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, so Edward, brilliant. So good to hear you. And we spoke recently, and yeah, what a trooper you are. And I'm really looking forward to getting to know you. I'm a combat veteran myself from many wars like Ed, and then I spent 15 years as a war photographer in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and East Africa. And then I moved to America and worked there as a commercial pilot. And so I was a commercial pilot on the day of 9/11, living in Mountain View, California. And then, you know, obviously as a pilot, I knew that the official story was a lie on the day. It was blatantly obvious as a pilot. So I got involved with the 9/11 truth movement on 9/11. And then, of course, got involved with the anti-war movement. But what I found was that and I became a member of Veterans for Peace. And then I ended up working for a guy called Dennis Kucinich, and I worked for Dennis for 2 years in 03-04 whilst he was running for president. And I was his bodyguard and a member of his close protection team, so I got to know Dennis pretty well. But what I found as you know, being a member of Veterans for Peace, I was with Chapter 101 in San Jose. I was living in Mountain View, but San Jose is sort of the nearest big town. And we did a tour around America, going along the southern route and then the northern route, giving. This is all before 2003. Trying to stop this war. But the big for me, the peace movement is controlled by the war movement. That's what I found.
That is not correct.
Well, it was where I'm just saying in America, because the one thing that wasn't allowed to be talked about, and I worked for a congressman and a presidential candidate, is the most powerful lobby group in Washington, D.C. There are thousands of lobbyists for all sorts of reasons, but there's only one lobby group that's called The Lobby, and that's the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. And so without them, there wouldn't be any wars in the Middle East. And there's every congressman and senator that I spoke to off the record would agree to that. But if you go up against AIPAC as a congressman or senator, you're not going to get re-elected. And Scott Ritter was a friend of mine who was a UN weapons inspector. So I think we need to talk about who are the warmongers.
Okay, yes, thank you, Michael. Thanks, Michael. I suppose we're close to wrapping up now. Has anybody else any more questions there?
Yeah, I'll just respond briefly.
Sorry.
There are problems involving AIPAC and Israel, but they're only part of the problem. What's happened, and there are very many Jewish people who disagree very strongly with what's happening in Palestine, and also that the US has its own so-called national interests, which involves getting access to resources and using wars as resource wars in the Middle East. So it's there are no simple explanations for the cause of wars, and there's a lot more involved than issues involving conspiracy theories concerning Israel or whatever. Clearly, there are huge crimes against humanity being committed by Israel and by others, but that is not the main cause of the wars in the Middle East. I believe it's wars of aggression and resource wars led by the US and NATO in gross breach of international law is what we need to be looking at.
Okay, thank you. There's another question there. How could pressure be built to force the government to stop supporting violent aggressors?
I think political pressure is important. We live in a democracy, as I mentioned earlier on, a relatively good democracy, but people don't use it enough or use it properly. Clearly, we're doing a bit at Shannon Airport, quite a bit over the years, but people need to talk and agitate with their various parliamentarians, PDs and senators. A lot can be done, but we're not doing enough.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do feel rather powerless, and that sometimes just taking a small action can change that, you know, and actually have quite a surprisingly positive effect. And just before we finish, I was going to ask you and just say congratulations on joining the board of World Beyond War there recently. Bravo, that's good for all of us. And does that give you hope? You know, maybe does that give you hope, or what else gives you hope in the world now that things might improve regarding wars? And
I suppose I am an optimist. I do see the US power is waning. They lost in Vietnam. They seem to have forgotten that. They largely lost in Iraq, and they lost in a very humiliating but dreadful way in Afghanistan at enormous cost to the people of the Middle East, and at enormous financial cost to the United States, but a huge financial cost again to the people in the countries of the Middle East. My feeling is the change will come. Hopefully it will come sooner rather than later. But for some reason I'm an optimist, maybe an incurable optimist. And just like to say hello to Kieran O'Reilly, who is, has been one of the landmark peace activists at Shannon Airport with the Catholic workers. Kieran, nice to see you.
Very good, very good. So maybe I'll hand over now to Eamon, because he's just going to do a little wrap up. So thanks very much.
And maybe one person I should have mentioned was Margaret Darcy, again one of the people who have inspired me and who has done several actions at Shannon Airport.
Okay. So Eamon, if you're there.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
We just thought before we wrapped up tonight, it would be a good thing to do and the right thing to do to acknowledge the 20 different actions and the 38 activists who are involved in those, just to make it, just to highlight, as Ed spoke about, that there's a number of people involved, and it took a huge commitment. So what I'm going to do is just a roll call of those 38 activists. I'll do it chronologically, and I'll read through the names, and in some instances I will note their affiliation. So we'll start off on the 4th of September 2002 with Owen Dubsky. On the 12th of October 2002, we acknowledge Paul McAndrew, Kieran Hegarty, James McBarron, Jarlath McGrath, Dr. Fintan Lane, Anthony Quinn, Robert Ford, Leon Butler, and Robert Morgan. Then on the 29th of January 2003, as Ed mentioned earlier, we had Mary Kelly. On the 3rd of February 2003, the Catholic workers, the 5 Catholic workers, they were Deirdre Clancy, Nuan Dunlop, Karen Fallon, Damien Moran, and Kieran O'Reilly. Then on the 3rd of April 2003, we had Edward Horgan in the High Court making his constitutional challenge. On the 18th of April 2003, we had the Catholic workers Jenny Hannon and Martin McGowan. On the 6th of December 2003, we had Owen Rice. In 2004, on the 24th of June, again, we had Ed Horgan, Aaron Baker, and Eileen Nihir. On October the 31st, 2004, the Catholic workers, Elaine O'Sullivan and Zelda Jeffers. On the 17th of September, 2005, Conor Cregan, Mags Liddy, St. John O'Donovan and Niall Hartnett. On the 23rd of May, 2007, Ed Horgan, and again on the 18th of June, 2008, Ed Horgan. On the 7th of October, 2012, we had Margaretta Darcy and Niall Farrell. On the 1st of September, 2013, Margaretta Darcy and Niall Farrell again. On the 13th of October, 2013, we had Tim Horgan and Ed Horgan. On the 22nd of July, 2014, we had Claire Daly and Mick Wallace. On the 18th of April, 2015, Ed Horgan. On the 5th of May, 2016, we had Dave Donnellan and Colin Roddy. On the 25th of April, 2017, Dan Dowling and Ed Horgan. And on the 17th of March, 2019, we had Tarek Kauf and Ken Myers from the US Veterans for Peace. So 38 names there, and we acknowledge all of their efforts to highlight the use and abuse of Shannon Airport. So that basically brings our session tonight to a close. I want to thank again Ed Horgan for his wonderful input, and to Peadar King for the great questions that he put. Thanks to Christine, thanks for the questions that we had at the end from Caroline, and again, thanks to everyone for being involved as participants tonight. We really value your participation in these events. We hope that you will keep in touch or keep an eye out for further events from World Beyond War. Please keep an eye on our social media. I think they should be up in the chat, but our Instagram and Facebook, keep an eye on them and they will keep you posted on forthcoming events. We are looking forward early in the new year to a further series of webinars, and they will feature some really interesting guests, including, for example, Laura Marlowe, and we have a couple of other people, Malalai Joya, and several others. So that, you know, they'll be really worth tuning into. So again, if you'd like to know more about us, please get in touch. Again, thanks to everyone for their involvement tonight and their participation. And again, thanks to Ed for his fantastic input. So with that said, we'll say goodnight, and we hope to hear from and see you all again. So thanks a million to everybody.
Thank you all.